Thank you. Because Todd is going to be giving a much more extensive presentation about what the 2026 legislature did, I'm only going to touch briefly on that, which we can see in the next slide. You may recognize this. It's a slide I borrowed from the Association of Washington Business. And what you can see is that the legislature increased the transportation budget by about $1.2 billion. About 800 million of that is new bonding authority, which has the advantage that it allows work to be moved up and done sooner. It has the disadvantage, of course, that the bonds have to be repaid with interest over time, which tends to limit budgeting flexibility in the out years. The budget includes about $400 million for preservation, which is certainly good and much overdue. And it includes only a small amount for ferry system preservation, which I think they're going to discover more of which will be needed in future years. Let's go to the next slide. I should also mention at the outset that I'm only speaking for myself here. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Good Roads Association. So the opinions expressed are only mine. I think you're all familiar with this slide, which I borrowed from WSGRTA. Todd's going to be showing us an updated one, but the numbers aren't that different. And of course, the important thing here is that with an average annual funding shortfall for highways of $960 million, adding $400 million in the 2026 session is a step in the right direction, but we're still on the glide path to failure, to quote former Secretary Millar. It may not be quite as steep, but the trajectory is still a very bad one. Down towards the bottom of this table, you can see the estimated ferry funding need at $240 million a year. I think that may be a little bit understated, actually, because the replacement value is actually much greater than $6 billion. But how much that need is going to depend some on what the legislature decides to do with the ferry electrification program. And I'll talk more about that later. So let's go to the next slide. In recent years, most of the focus has been on highway system preservation and maintenance. One thing that hasn't gotten much attention, or at least not enough, is what the needs are for capacity expansion and improvement. And when I was with the Department of Transportation, I was the planning manager for King and Snohomish County for several years. And in 2016, I asked the department's ACE modeling team if they could show me on a map what the level of service would be like on the state highway system in King and Snohomish County in the year 2030. And that's what you can see here. It's not a pretty picture. The green line are where the state highways are operating at level of service C or better, which is really pretty good. Yellow is level of service D. Red, brown, and black are level of service F or worse. And as you can see, most of the state highways in the Puget Sound region, at least in King and Snohomish County, by 2030, were forecast to operate at level of service F or worse. That's just peak hour, but we can already see that on many state highways, congestion extends far beyond the peak period. I-5 in particular, but also on many others. And I point this out because when the system becomes too congested, it becomes very inefficient and it defeats the state's other transportation policy goals for economic development and for mobility and even environmental things, because more congestion means more fuel gets wasted, stuck in traffic. So this is not a good future that we should be working towards. State law requires the Department of Transportation to prepare a state highway system plan that looks out 20 years and identifies how these needs can be met. But the Department of Transportation has not updated the plan in a way that complies with the state requirement since 2007. So the existing plan is way, way out of date. And there is no coherent long-range plan that shows what the needs are to improve highway system performance and accommodate expected growth and demand over the next 20 years. And that's something that the legislature is going to need to pay attention to in the future. Let's go to the next slide. Because we already know that needs for both preservation and maintenance and the undefined needs for system expansion are far beyond current Department of Transportation revenues, it raises the question, how can they be paid for in the future? And in this last session of the legislature, they looked at some possibilities. Obviously, they did not want to raise taxes, or at least there wasn't a consensus in support of that, though in recent years they have increased various fees and so on. And in 2025, they increased the gas tax. But there are some ways that they can increase funding for the state highway system without increasing taxes. And one is to shift sales tax revenue from the sale of automobiles to the transportation budget. Senator Fortunato has introduced a bill that would do that, I think, every year for the last 5 years or something like that. Another is to allow use of the the Climate Commitment Act funds for selected highway purposes. This is, of course, very controversial. I think there was a bill that would have done that in the 2026 session. It didn't get anywhere, though I believe that they did allow the use of CCA funds for the Carbon River Bridge replacement. And there may be a stronger case for this because there are highway system improvements, especially bridge replacements and some others, where you could probably show that it actually reduces congestion and results in a more efficient highway system. It's also been pointed out that many of the projects that are receiving CCA funds don't actually reduce the state's carbon footprint. So this is something that I hope the legislature will look at in the coming biennium. Road user charge, or VMT tax, as a substitute for the gas tax has come up. It's a favorite of Representative Fye. I expect we'll be seeing more bills along those lines. If it's just a substitute for the gas tax and it's protected by the 18th Amendment, so it's dedicated to highway system purposes, it may be a good approach, especially as the vehicle fleet shifts more towards electric and hybrid power. I've listed congestion pricing here. It hasn't been getting a lot of love, which is too bad because unlike a road user charge or a flat VMT tax, congestion pricing creates value for users. And we've already seen it successfully applied with the I-405 express toll lanes and to some extent on the 520 bridge. Because congestion pricing increases system efficiency and smooths traffic flow, it really does create benefits not just for the users, but for all of us. And the department, as you know, has implemented congestion pricing in a number of places and have gone about it in kind of a piecemeal fashion, but it's really been pretty successful. And it has the advantage that it can be done incrementally. There's already a couple million people with good to go passes, and it's very flexible. I think the reason it hasn't been viewed more favorably by policymakers is because the revenue stream is not as predictable as it is with a VMT tax. But it's unfortunate if they're not giving this more consideration, especially where highway system capacity projects are being considered. And then last on the list is paying for non-highway projects like culvert fixes with general fund revenue instead of robbing the transportation fund to pay for it. Okay, let's go to the next slide. In case you're wondering, I'm not saying that streamlined Art Deco ferries are the wave of the future for the highway for the ferry system, but this is just a neat picture. The ferry system has been looking hard at how to renew the fleet. The long-range plan that was adopted in 2019 called for adding 9 new ferries by 2030. Right now, it looks like they'll be lucky to get just one new ferry by then. So the fleet renewal plan is about a decade behind schedule, and this is resulting in service interruptions and much higher costs for maintaining the old ferries and trying to keep them running. Uh, the situation is likely to get worse over the next 4 years. So let's go to the next slide. Even though the focus has been on fleet renewal, that's distracted policymakers from another trend that I think is maybe just as consequential, and that has been the increase in operating costs. As you can see in this graph, operating cost per hour and per passenger was pretty level up to about 2017, started going up in 2018 and 2019, and then COVID hit and ridership fell, costs increase, and the trend has been just disastrous since then. The reason I bring this up is not only because it's a budget problem, but because the solution to this is really going about fleet renewal in a way that allows the Department of Transportation to rein in these costs. Let's look at the next slide. Here we can see the trend in fare box recovery. Back in 2018, the ferry system recovered about 75% of its operating costs through fare box revenue. By transit standards, that's very good, but the trends are bad. Fare box revenue has gone down. At the same time, operating costs have gone up. So now fare box revenue only covers about 50% of operating expenses. This is a budget buster. And this is not a one-time thing. It means that the gap is growing and it's likely to get worse in the future. And by the way, the difference between a 50% and a 75% fare box recovery ratio for the ferry system is about $100 million a year. So that indicates that a very large ongoing increase in operating subsidy is going to be needed for the ferry system to maintain the current service levels unless they can bring down operating costs or increase their revenue. The ferry system has already increased fares several times, and I believe their budget anticipates that they will do so more in the future. But it's not nearly enough to keep up with the increase in operating costs. To close this gap, to get back to a 50% fare box, to get back to a 75% fare box recovery ratio, you'd need to increase fares by about $4 or $5 a passenger. And politically, I'm not sure that that's feasible. So the solution to this problem really needs to be part of the fleet renewal plan. And in the 2026 legislative session, the legislature did not approve funding for 3 additional very expensive hybrid electric ferries. What they did do is they funded a study that will look at fleet needs and what the ferry system can do. And that study will inform the 2027 legislature. But it's vitally important that that study be very carefully scoped, that it ask the right questions, and that it looks at a range of possibilities, including right-sized clean diesel ferries that the ferry system has not been willing to seriously consider. If the ferry system continues with their hybrid electric fleet renewal plan, their budget situation is going to get much worse, both because the capital costs are very high, both for the ferries and for electrifying the terminals, and because the hybrid electric ferries are really too big to operate efficiently on most ferry system routes. That's not just my opinion. That was based on the 4 years I worked at the ferry system and the documents that I saw at the time. Buying right-sized ferries instead of 400-foot-long, 5,000-ton, 1,500 capacity ferries, which is what the hybrid electric ones will be, something closer to the Issaquah class size ferries, will be much more economical to acquire, more flexible in their operation, and potentially have significantly lower operating costs. So let's go to the next slide. Moving on to transit. The state of Washington has some of the most generously funded transit agencies on a per capita basis in the country. And as we can see in this slide, total transit revenue in the state has gone from 3.3 billion in 2014 to almost 6 billion in 2024. The legislature has been very permissive in enabling transit systems. The RCW allows 5 or 6 different kinds of transit agencies, each with an independent board. Many of them are appointed, not even elected, and each of them has dedicated tax revenue over which they have complete control. Unfortunately, the RCW is not nearly as extensive when it comes to requiring any accountability. And what we see on this slide is not just the growth in revenue, but the blue line is total annual ridership for Washington State transit agencies. As you can see, it was growing slowly from 2014 to 2019, not really even keeping up with population growth, but a little bit of growth. And then COVID hit and it fell dramatically, and it hasn't completely recovered since. I point this out because over the same period of time, the last dozen years, the state has significantly increased the state funding for transit systems. That used to be regarded as a local responsibility or regional responsibility, but the state funding has increased, and so it's been over 1.2 billion over the 11 years. Unfortunately, when you look at what the state has funded with those dollars, it's not clear that we're getting a positive return on the state subsidy. Of the 32 regional mobility transit grants that the state has funded, only 3 of them, I believe, hit their performance targets, and 13 of them were more than 50% below their performance targets. So the question that I would like the legislature to think about is, what's the higher priority? Funding preservation and maintenance of state transportation assets like bridges and highways, or additional subsidy to transit agencies that have their own funding source? And by the way, of the 32 transit agencies in the state of Washington, only 7 even collect tax at the maximum rate authorized by the RCW. So there's a significant policy question there that the legislature may need to come to grips with. Let's go to the next slide. As some of you may know, I worked as a transportation planner in the state of Washington for most of the last 30 years. And I made my living doing transportation plans. So I think transportation plans are great. But when we look at transportation system performance, what we see is most of the trends are pretty bad. And it raises the question, why is it that we've done all this planning, but we're not getting the desired outcome? As I mentioned earlier, the legislature has been very permissive in granting authority to agencies, cities, counties, transit agencies. And they provide a lot of funding. We've got very high transportation taxes in this state. The RCW also has a lot of planning requirements, but there's no requirement for outcomes and there's no accountability. So where did we go wrong? Well, when I look at the plans that have been adopted in the past, many of them are based on very unrealistic aspirations. The PSRC plan is a case in point, but there are many others. The plans that are adopted very rarely reflect actual trends. And again, we can see that with transit, where the PSRC plan assumed that transit ridership was going to double or more by 2040, but actually we'll be lucky if we get back to the 2018 level of ridership by 2040. And this becomes a problem with things like the IBR, the I-5 Columbia River Bridge project, where the initial plan there assumed very high ridership on a light rail extension across the Columbia River, but they've had to revise those down by 70% or something like that, because the trends just couldn't justify such wildly optimistic forecasts. Another problem is that there are conflicting and competing goals among the various agencies that are involved in transportation. I experienced this when I was with the Department of Transportation at a PSRC meeting where they were working on the initial stages of a 2040 plan update for the Puget Sound region. And they were thinking about what the goals of the plan should be. And wearing my WSDOT hat, I said, well, I think congestion reduction should be one of the goals of the plan. This was followed by an awkward silence. And then the King County representative spoke up and said he couldn't support that because his agency wasn't trying to reduce congestion. And if that was one of the goals of the plan, it would put them at a disadvantage in competing for the federal funds that the PSRC distributes. So that's just one example of the kind of conflicts which are not resolved by the current planning process. And it's something that the legislature can solve. And if they don't, we're likely to see continued plans that are in conflict and that produce poor outcomes. I also mentioned the misallocation of resources here. I have to give another example. At the PSRC, when I was with WSDOT, we worked with some cities, especially on the east side in King County, for a traffic signal coordination proposal that would have significantly reduced traffic congestion and increased system efficiency on state highways in East King County. We submitted that as part of the competitive grant process. It finished last. And in that same grant process, they awarded funding to Seattle for the South Lake Union Trolley, which has since become a boondoggle that carries very few riders and actually messes up traffic in SoDo. It's so bad that even the city of Seattle is talking about decommissioning it, taking it out of service. So when we have organizations like the PSRC that are responsible for distributing billions of dollars in federal funding, and they're going to projects that don't improve transportation system performance or efficiency, we've got a problem. And this is another thing that the legislature, if they put their mind to it, could help improve. Finally, at the bottom of this slide, you can see I mentioned Senate Bill 6335 that was introduced in this last session, and it would have revised the state's planning and policy setting process, mostly by removing functions that are currently assigned to the State Transportation Commission. I'm encouraged that the legislature is thinking about planning and policy roles and responsibilities, because clearly they have not been conducted in a way that's addressing the state's transportation needs. But this particular bill was so narrowly focused that it wouldn't address the problems with all of the other agencies that actually are responsible for implementation and develop plans that can conceivably have a real impact on how investment in our transportation system is made in the future. It's true the State Transportation Commission does adopt the Washington Transportation Plan, but I think I'm one of the few people who even bothers to read it. Let's go to the next slide. So for the 2027 session, there's some opportunities and some tasks that I hope the legislature will take on. One is they did include funding for a Department of Transportation study of preservation and maintenance needs. They need to incorporate the findings of that study in their 2027 budget. They also need to initiate expedited procurement for new ferries, and I think the study that they will be conducting in 2026 will show that right-sized clean diesel ferries are a far more economical way to go about it, and that they can be acquired sooner and at lower cost. I think it is long overdue for the legislature to direct WSDOT to complete an updated highway system plan that actually complies with the RCW requirement. Under Secretary Millar, right at the end of 2024, they did produce a document they claimed was a state highway system plan, but it included no list of projects, no cost estimates, no LOS service needs. So it was not terribly useful. In fact, not useful at all. As I mentioned, the state's transit grant programs have not really been producing the desired outcome, and so I think there's a need for a performance audit of the state transit grant programs. Also looking at some of the transit agencies, as I'm sure you're all aware, Sound Transit is looking at a $34 billion budget gap which should cause any policymaker to question whether their plan is workable or sensible. And along with that is a need for a study of transportation governance and accountability. That's kind of consistent with the Senate Bill 6335. If the legislature goes into the 2027 session thinking that this is just another instance where they can find some budget band-aids and everything will be fine, they're wrong. The planning and policymaking process simply isn't delivering the desired outcomes, and some shift in governance and increased accountability are essential if we're hoping to do better in the future. And last, if they look at additional revenue sources, I think it's essential that the 18th Amendment be applied to them, especially if it's any kind of tolling, road user charge, or anything along those lines, because clearly the needs for highway preservation and maintenance should be a top priority, and we can't afford to have those funds diverted to other uses. So I think I've exceeded my allotted 15 minutes. I can try and answer questions if you have any brief ones.